Hello and welcome to the Africa Hour, the show where we dedicate time and expertise to one policy issue in one African country, looking at it from different perspectives. I am Olumide Abimbola. This season, we are focusing on Africa's growing tech ecosystem. And today, we are in Rwanda, where the country's technology ministry has announced exciting new plans for the rollout of a first-of-its-kind smart identity card that will have unique features. Across Africa, poor identification is a serious problem. About 1 billion people around the world do not have identification documents. And the United Nations says having a legal identity is a fundamental human right. In fact, one of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, what we call SDGs, is to provide legal identification for everyone. In Rwanda, nearly 800,000 of the 13 million population do not have any means of identification. No ID cards, no birth certificates, no driver's license. But the new system will be an improvement, officials say. The new Smart ID will have biometric features, which will make verification more seamless and which will include more vulnerable groups like the elderly. That all sounds great, but can Rwanda really pull off such a system and avoid digital pitfalls? And what are the possible issues that digital ID systems might actually be making worse? I speak to 3 experts on the topic, including a researcher who is passionate about digital IDs and another researcher whose passion is speaking against digital ID systems. That is in a minute. So, does Rwanda really have the infrastructure for its new digital IDs, and will vulnerable groups like the elderly or people living in rural communities be included in the process? I'm speaking to Hudson Kutesa, a seasoned journalist with the New Times, Rwanda's leading newspaper. Hello, Hudson.
Hi, Olumide.
We also have Hilda Barasa, a senior policy advisor with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and a digital ID champion. Hello, Hilda.
Hi, Olumide.
And lastly, we have Caitlin Chiofi, a senior research scholar at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the New York University. Welcome, Caitlin.
Hi, Olumide.
So, Hudson, I want to start with you. You've been reporting on this new digital ID that has gotten, identity and tech advocates in Rwanda and around the world pretty excited. So, I want to invite you to help us sort of set the scene. What is the ID situation right now in Rwanda? And maybe you can also tell us what exactly is going to change with the new ID and the new system.
Sure, thanks a lot. The current digital ID in Rwanda is one where we use plastic identity cards, which are machine read, and they can be used for different services, but they cannot be authenticated online. They cannot really go far. So this year, the government proposed a new digital ID, which is they think they can bring it out in the next 3 years. And this digital ID will be able to be authenticated online. We'll have features that use technologies like biometrics, iris scans, and things like QR codes, which allow you to verify or to authenticate yourself online and make you able to get more services than you could get with this kind of machine-read IDs that we have currently.
Yeah, this sounds pretty good. It sounds like there's an issue that the government has decided to find a way to fix. But I can imagine that this is going to cost a lot of money.
Yeah, so the budget is about $40 million, and all of this is going to be provided by the World Bank. You can imagine that our leaders have already sold the idea to people that are really interested in the digital economy and the world, jumping onto this digital bandwagon. So the World Bank has already accepted to fund this particular project, and they were only waiting for the bill, for the law to be given green light by the parliament, which happened about 2 months ago. So now everything is in place. All they are waiting for is to get this funding, and within 3 years, the ID may be rolled out.
Right. I'm still curious, though, about the practical aspects of this new ID. We've had even newborn babies will be captured. But, really, how will the government deal with getting to people in remote areas? How will the registration for this be done?
So currently the things related to ID are really developed in Rwanda. Though that digital ID is something that is really new, a new idea, but Rwandans are really used to the things related to identification, because Rwandans, like for the past 20 years, have been having digital IDs. And we have very efficient kind of local governance where people can easily access, every kind of services, including registration. So registration and reaching out to people in rural communities should not be an issue.
How does this connect to the Irembo platform that exists right now in the country?
So Irembo is an online portal that we use to access various government services. Today, hundreds of services can be accessed from this platform using our IDs, but not in a digital way, because you just have to feed in the number, and then the National Identification Authority can use that number to authenticate that you are the person that is requesting for this service. So with the Irembo platform, we can get services like birth certificates, marriage certificates, things like where you reside, and many other services. So that's the Irembo.
I'm wondering, though, and we can come back to this later in the discussion, how effective the system currently is at the moment, the Irembo system, but we'll come back to that later. I want to bring Hilda into the discussion. Hilda, we spent some time and looked at your Twitter timeline, and we noticed that a very good percentage of your tweets are about digital IDs. So I think it's safe to say that you're excited about Rwanda's plans. But I'm curious, why are IDs so important to you personally? We know that IDs can help people get better services, help governments know, the number of their populations, understand them a bit better so that they can plan well. But why does this have to be digital?
If we take a step back, you mentioned earlier, sort of like at the start of the recording, that a majority of the invisible billion people globally who lack basic identity credentials live in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this essentially means that when you lack that basic level of identification, your access to public services, to social welfare, and even to private sector systems that, inclusive of financial platforms that are powering sort of like the digital economy, that kind of access to such services is quite limited to you. So essentially you're locked out of what is increasingly becoming the norm rather than the exception. So a digital identity is something that underpins sort of like a country's digital infrastructure, and it's by and large considered to be a key enabler for the digital economy. So if you have a digital ID, you're able to access improved public services because the government can have a deeper understanding of your needs as a citizen. And it also helps to build a strong and more inclusive digital economy. So if we think of, the last 3-4 years coming out of the COVID pandemic, where people were not able to go physically to public service offices or to a private sector business, everything had to be done digitally. So you needed to have a means of identifying yourself for you to be able to access such services remotely. So COVID was definitely a key driver for the push for digital ID globally. And if we think of the continent itself, it's projected that 61% of all internet connections that will be developing in Africa are all going to be connections that are done through mobile phones. So a lot of this, we need to be able to prove who we are digitally in that sense. And then a digital ID enables you to save both time and money. So if I think of the traditional means of getting a government service, you would have to travel to a government office, you would have to meet with the different state civil servants who prove your case for why you want something, go back, you have to go home and wait for weeks to receive a decision. But if you're able to do something digitally, you could sit in your house, apply for something on your mobile phone. Hudson talked about Irembo. You could be able to apply for something online on Irembo, prove your identity for why you're requesting that service. And if possible, receive a decision in minutes, right? So if the system approves your request because the data already exists, you're able to get your decision in minutes without you necessarily having to travel back and forth to, the different offices. And so personally, I'm very excited to see Rwanda committing to digital ID. I think the government's objective to...
See, I knew you were going to be excited by that already.
Yeah, I think that, the government's objective to build this digital ID ecosystem to enable residents to use, smart ID cards or digital IDs to register and access government and private sector services online is definitely the right way to go.
So tell me more about your recent research that you published. You tried to understand, if I remember correctly, what the benefits of a digital ID are to people, not governments, and you looked at 4 countries, including Rwanda. Why did you conduct that research, and what were your major findings?
When we as an institute looked around, we realized that there is a complete white space that exists when it comes to quantifying sort of like the potential productivity benefits of integrating digital ID systems into routine activities, and then the associated economic impact on different demographic groups. So we wanted to use this research to plug this knowledge gap and to be able to really quantify what is the economic benefit to me as an individual? Why should I want a digital ID as an individual or a citizen of a country, particularly when, there's a lot of pushback on data privacy, inclusivity, and such things. So we were able to focus our research on 4 use cases in particular in Rwanda that relied on identification for you to be able to get it. So we looked at remote registration for medical insurance. Okay. We looked at the payment of social grants, registration for social grants as well, and remote financial account onboarding. We also looked at education as well, but we found that particularly for the education, IDs were not necessarily being used to register for education subsidies. And this is partly because a portion of that is there's free primary education. There's a portion that parents needed to apply for, so it wasn't widely in use. And so throughout the study, we looked at the demographic groups that would be typically marginalized. So these are the elderly, rural women. We looked at informal workers as well. And we got, really surprising results. Out of all the use cases that we looked at, enabling remote registration for medical insurance, which is tied to sort of like the social welfare classification system that Hudson talked about, and the remote payment of social grants could be particularly impactful use cases for digital ID. So, for example, an individual could save up to 2.2% of their monthly income for medical insurance, for example, if they're able to use a digital ID for that particular use case.
Right.
The value add mostly would come from being able to cut travel and queuing time. So in some of the more remote villages that we went to, medical insurance registration centers could be located 3 to 4 hours away. And so most of these vulnerable population groups would have to walk that distance. So you wake up early in the morning, you're walking to the medical insurance registration center, then you'd have to queue for services that could take maybe 3 to 4 hours, because the challenge for Rwanda was that even though the national ID card have a digital component to it, it wasn't being leveraged. These centers were not able to scan the NIDs. And so the process would take even longer just for somebody to get registered for medical insurance. And then you'd have to now walk back to where you are or where you're coming from. And so when you think of an individual spending their entire day, one either trying to register or to receive a service, that's an opportunity cost to you as an individual. So increasing that digital engagement for these particular use cases could deliver multi-million-dollar savings and benefits to individuals.
Thank you. I mean, you seem to have made a very compelling case for why digital IDs make all the sense. So I'm turning now to you, Caitlin. There's a huge counter debate as well against what has been laid out by Hilda so far. Based on your research, these digital ID systems, they've tended to exclude people instead of including them. How is that?
I would start by saying I think a lot of the positive benefits of digital ID that Hilda has laid out are ones that we're all interested in achieving. I think, there's a lot of promise to digital technology and digital innovation, and the human rights movement as a whole has always been quite interested, I think, in leveraging those technologies to improve human rights. But most of our research has focused on digital ID systems that are being built by governments. So similar to the project that has been discussed in Rwanda, although I will certainly preface my remarks by saying that I've not done research on Rwanda and I'm not familiar with the detailed plans of the new Smart ID card as my panelists here. But we've looked at a lot of other government-led digital ID systems around the world in places like Uganda, for instance. And what this research has really shown is that many national digital ID systems often struggle with problems of exclusion. And this exclusion can take on a lot of different forms. First, there are often groups or individuals who end up excluded entirely from the digital ID system because they're simply unable or in some cases unwilling to register. Second, even when someone has been enrolled, they may be enrolled on adverse terms, which may leave them vulnerable to further exclusion and discrimination. For instance, there could be errors in their data, or they might have biometrics such as fingerprints that are difficult to read, which makes different stages of verification and authentication more difficult for them. So they are part of the system, but it's actually very difficult for them to use the benefits that are available. Or they might be categorized as part of an ethnic or minority group that is subject to discriminatory treatment in the country. So this will leave them further vulnerable to discriminatory treatment. And finally, I think it's really important to recognize that while there are certainly a lot of promises associated with digital ID systems, these are databases that can be weaponized as a tool by both governments and the private sector to exclude, to surveil, and to exert control over different groups. And a lot of our work, because we focus on the rights of those who are most vulnerable, such as those living in poverty, ethnic minorities, and older persons, has shown that the real problems with digital ID systems often arrive when they're integrated into public services and into essential services. Because this is the time when having a digital ID or not will determine whether or not you're able to enjoy certain rights. So this includes things like healthcare, social protection, or other forms of government services, where if you're excluded from the digital ID system, or you're allowed to register but only on adverse terms, then the harmful impacts of this initial exclusion can quickly multiply. And this can lead to something that activists in India have actually called social death, where the phenomenon of being locked out of multiple government services at the same time can essentially lead to the deterioration of enjoyment of multiple rights. I can give one detailed example from Uganda, where we've been doing research with civil society partners there for several years, and where millions of adults are still excluded from the national ID system. And in particular, older persons have really struggled to register for national ID cards because they often have trouble providing reliable biometric fingerprints. They're often unable to produce sufficient documents, such as birth certificates or other forms of proof of identity to satisfy the registration requirements that have been imposed by the government. And often they're simply unable to reach physical registration points or to pay some of the fees that are associated with correcting errors or making changes to one's details. And the result is that by being excluded from the national ID system, these older persons have actually then been excluded from vital programs of social protection, including things like cash transfers that are targeted at alleviating poverty and are often the only source of income for vulnerable older persons. So it's a double layer of exclusion that has essentially locked out some of these older persons from the benefits that they are entitled to from the Ugandan government. And there are many more examples of this type of exclusion that can be seen in other national contexts. I think most notably in India, where the Aadhaar biometric identification system is the largest in the world and has been a major source of contestation, where vulnerable individuals and families have been cut off from poverty alleviation programs, from access to government services, including taxation, and where we're also seeing the kind of weaponization of the Aadhaar system to exclude ethnic minority groups.
I'm curious, do you have any examples from the global north? I live in Germany and we also have digital systems. Are developed countries also at risk of this?
Sure, I can give an example from the country that I'm sitting in right now, which is the United Kingdom, where the government tried to introduce a very different kind of digital identification system, what's called a federated model of digital identity, which instead of having kind of one single central issued ID, uses a number of identity providers that can come from either the public or the private sector. So here, for instance, the post office was one of the providers of identity credentials. And the intention was similar to a lot of other ID systems in the world, in that this would become the gateway to accessing remote and online services. And the system, which was called Verify, was integrated into one of the flagship social protection or social welfare programs here, which is called Universal Credit. But the system itself was difficult to access for those who didn't have access to, for instance, the correct model of smartphone or couldn't accurately put their information in through the remote platform, found themselves unable to verify their identity and therefore unable to access their universal credit record online. And so this became a major source of exclusion, and the program was actually abandoned by the government because of a variety of reasons, but I think is another example of a very different kind of digital identity system, but exhibiting some of the same exclusionary tendencies that we see in more centralized systems that have been favored in a lot of other countries who are just embarking on their digital ID journeys.
Thank you. And all of this and the cautions you have for us make me wonder, how can Rwanda guarantee that people's security will actually not be violated with this system? Digital upgrades, of course, have their benefits, but they also bear the risks, some of which you've heard just now. Do possible data leaks or hacker attacks worry journalists like, you covering the topic, Hudson?
Sure. So before I go to that, actually, I'll need to react to some things that she has just said now. For example, about the costs of these updates of information on these digital IDs. The ID in Rwanda, the officials say everything is going to be free from the first time they issue the IDs, even when you need things like upgrading or updating your data on these kind of IDs. In addition to that, things like exclusion because of disability, perhaps someone doesn't have a hand. The officials say here that there will be some compromises. For example, if you don't maybe have the left hand, they can take the biometrics of the right hand. If you don't have hands, then they can take those of the toes. If you don't have both, still there can be a way of making compromises to make sure that you have an ID which may not really require you to have everything like a normal person has. And also, when I was reporting on this digital ID, one of the questions that we asked were in regards to safety. Though they did not divulge a lot of details, but they said that everything is going to work in the framework of international laws.
Hilda, what do you say to the digital ID risks that Caitlin has raised?
I think Caitlin has raised really important points, and we have to acknowledge that, yes, there are risks to digital ID, but I think the opportunity cost of not implementing a digital ID is higher than the risks. And there are certain ways that you could be able to mitigate against some of the very real risks that Caitlin has pointed out. At the Institute, we've always said, when it comes to thinking through how do you ensure that there is inclusivity from the word go, right? I think a government has to be able to ask three key things, right? How easily can an individual in the country access digital identity? And this cascades down to the registration process, right? So in Rwanda, for example, with the Irembo network, Irembo runs a network of agents across the country. So there's an opportunity for Rwanda to actually leverage the existing networks that are there, particularly to provide comprehensive training to the cell leaders on the importance and benefits of digital ID to ensure that there is increased uptake, particularly within the community who might not know about digital ID or the benefits of it. And also the legal framework is also quite important. So you need to be able to have a strong governance and legal framework that ensures three things. It establishes that data protection and privacy laws, which would be able to comply with local and regional regulations, because again, a country like Rwanda also exists within sort of like the East Africa community. So this ensures that if there are cases of discrimination that occur either in public service delivery, if somebody is using sort of like your digital ID to essentially deny you a service based on who you are, that there are appropriate regulatory oversights and audits that are able to capture this and mechanisms for redressing this. And also ensuring that when it comes to redress, you give people the opportunity to know where to go if they encounter problems. And I think Rwanda, and Hudson, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there is an annual checks and balances system that the president usually chairs that involves ministers. You know, it goes all the way down to cell leaders, down to the people, and people are able to cascade their problems upwards. So this kind of system itself, it's almost like a report card, the way that I understand it works, but it allows people to say where they have issues, and it allows for the central government to pick up on these issues at a more frequent level. So this, these are some of the ways that you'd be able to pick up on these exclusionary measures.
Thank you, Hilda. I mean, I can see that Caitlin is taking notes, so I can imagine she has some points to make on this. But I'm going to come back to you right after we do this. Every episode, we go to the country to talk to people. And for this, we went to Kigali to speak to people. And we asked them how easy it is to get an ID card or ID document of any kind right now, as they are anticipating the smart IDs that are coming.
I'm Alan Bowers. I run salon business in Kigali. I am 24 years old. I have an ID card which is digital and physical. I go to the government institution which is called NIDA, and I registered for requesting that ID. They gave it to me in 7 days, and I use it for every service I need everywhere, like registering permit or requesting permit exam for health issues, like going to hospital, requesting services like consultant, in order to know that my age is real as I have been told them.
My name is Kaihura Rashide. I'm a small business owner here in Kigali. I know it's a digital ID card we have since 2008 or 9. Yeah. For the first time, it's a long process. It's a first registration, and you wait for 3 months or 4 months for a photo and a fingerprint, and you wait like 3 or 4 months for getting an ID. But here, when you lost it, it can take you like a 6 months or a year to get another one when you lost it. Yeah, that is the process. The institution which is offer the ID always say it's an easy process, but when you want it, it's a wrong process. To travel without the ID is illegal here in Rwanda. They can arrest you when they take you without an ID in a road, in public. That's one. The second one, ID here is a life. In a bank, in everywhere in public services, you use an ID. Without an ID, there is no service. That is the second.
My name is Kaitari Jean Bosco. I'm a graphic designer. I have my professional ID card and my national identity card on a bank ATM. It's a nice ID compared to the cards in the region, but it's limited also when it comes to information in it. First, since I got it a long time ago, it was very difficult because we had to go first to register with our local leaders, then go to the sector level. They would write you into that registration book. It wasn't digital then. Then They took another 2 weeks for taking photos and biometric fingerprints. After that, then they gave us a small sheet like a receipt with a number. Then after 1 month later, then this when they announced at the radio that would go and look for IDs at our respective zones where we applied them from. So basically, it took like 2 months in the beginning.
That was Alan, Rashid, and John Bosco in Kigali. So let's talk about solutions now. As we've heard, there used to be and there still are difficulties with delivering ID documents to people in Rwanda. So obviously, it looks like an upgrade to the process will be welcome. Caitlin, like I noted earlier, you were taking notes. I want to channel your notes now towards solutions of some kind in this system. As Rwanda is designing the process, how can the authorities make sure that they don't fall into the trap that others have fallen into, some of which you've spoken about, when it comes to ensuring that everyone's human rights are met and even protected? So what laws, what policies, what processes have to be in place already before anything is rolled out?
Well, I think Hilda has already done a great job of outlining some of the safeguards and mitigations that are available. And I would just kind of add a few more on top of this and first say that I think in a lot of countries now, one of the things that civil society is asking for is to have human rights impact assessments integrated into the digital ID planning process from the beginning, and to have these assessments take a much broader view than just thinking about issues of privacy and data protection, but instead to use the evidence that we have from other countries around the world that shows some of the potential pitfalls, and to try and understand how some of them might be relevant in the context. So certainly in Rwanda, not all of the pitfalls that have kind of affected other systems around the world will be true, but I think there's potentially a lot to learn there about what can go wrong, how to plan for failures, rather than to assume that they can be mitigated, because I think it's a major struggle with many of these systems where we all get quite excited about new technologies, about the potential to solve some of these really big, thorny problems that governments have been struggling with for decades, for centuries in some cases, to assume that they will work out, that the technology will be capable of addressing edge cases and problems. But failures are inevitable in any major public policy initiative, and that includes ones that involve technology. Even the technology itself, we put a lot of stock in biometrics, but they're not always perfect. So I think it's important to use impact assessments, think about the entire range of human rights that might be affected, and to plan for those cases where things will fail and break down, because I think even with the best of intentions, that's inevitable. I think having the consultation and participation element integrated throughout the project is also really important. Hilda talked about using the existing governance structures that are in place in the country, which I think is always best practice. But I think also being attentive to how the links between the digital identity system and those structures change over time. Because one of the worrying problems that we've seen in other countries is that projects that start really leveraging local knowledge, community-based participation, the tendency with digital systems that are built on remote services is that over time, as they become more advanced, the decision-making processes move farther and farther away from the communities. So there's less transparency, more decisions are being made by things like machine learning and algorithms, and it becomes much more difficult to feed in problems if the shift is really towards more remote services. You think about the benefits of being able to sit in your house and access healthcare, but you don't think about the fact that often that means that there isn't a local clinic being built nearby that would be the natural touch point for you to access healthcare services. And I think the final thing I would just say here is that I think the tendency with a lot of digital ID systems, whether they're new or improved or just have a few added features, is to start experimenting with them within programs like social protection and healthcare, within what we refer to in our project as the digital welfare state, because these are often areas where there's a lot of need, There's the need for innovation. There is a lot of unmet needs within most countries in the world when it comes to accessing systems of social protection and healthcare. But the negative part of that early integration with a digital ID system into these programs that are often targeted at vulnerable and marginalized groups is that you're experimenting on people who are already experiencing vulnerability. So if there are negative impacts, if there are harms that are associated with the digital ID systems, they're the ones who are feeling them first, and they're the ones who are feeling them most.
Right. It's going to be amplified even more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that it really is a salutary lesson to a lot of governments that it's not always the best strategy to use these systems on the poor, on vulnerable groups, before they're really ready to be integrated, because you are only going to deepen inequalities and amplify some of the exclusions that already exist.
Yeah, thank you for that point. In addition to that, I'm just thinking as we're speaking also of the point you made earlier of creating a very good feedback loop into the process such that you're learning quickly and fixing problems before they become intractable, that the system finds a way of learning from what is happening and fixing it before it becomes a bigger problem than it already is. I'm going to stay a bit with the point you made about vulnerable people and turn to you, Hilda. This is also an infrastructure question, right? Because if you're going to be providing digital ID to people, you have to think about those who don't have access to the infrastructure that allow them to do this. People who don't have access to cell phones, who live in remote areas where it's difficult to capture anything. What advice would you have for the policymakers working on this in this context?
Thanks for that. And I think just before I speak to that, I think Caitlin raised really important points, particularly on the human rights impact assessment. It's increasingly coming up even in digital ID circles. So it's great to, just reiterate the importance of that now. And I think for most countries right now, it's helping them to understand that technology is not it's not a panacea or a solution to everything. You can leverage it to help you increase your efficiencies. You can leverage it to help you deliver public services better, but it has to be within the context of inclusivity and just making sure that, such things such as human rights abuses or inequality is not perpetuated by layering technology onto existing systems. And also something that would be good for more governments to consider is to develop sort of like sandboxes for such services. So essentially, it would mean that you're not running the risk of rolling out something in a massive scale across vulnerable groups of populations and then having it fail in that sense. So you're not experimenting with a large group of people, but you're able to create sort of like a sandbox for you to test out. Within that sandbox, so if you combine that with sort of like user-centric design, designing a system with the end user in mind, making sure that it's something that's very simple to use, simple to understand, regardless of a person's tech literacy level, this ensures essentially that you're really thinking of the end user from the word go, and that you're building something with inclusivity in mind and inclusivity in demonstrating inclusivity in action. You're not requiring like 1,001 different documents that people would not be able to have, that then would lock out people from enrolling at the first place. So ensuring that there are multiple channels that people can use. So whether this includes the use of mobile devices or even traditional ones such as kiosks that people can use. And even in South Africa, for example, banks were able to increase sort of like digital onboarding of accounts. So they created kiosks in supermarkets. And they went down to, this is the supermarket that's mostly frequented in town A, for example, and they created like a kiosk there that would enable people to then enroll for a digital ID, use that digital ID to open up a bank account. We've talked about the Irembo network. I cannot have this enough. That really expansive agent network that exists within Irembo, if you combine that with the local governance system, you're able to really just increase channels of access.
Right. Thank you. And you mentioned Irembo and you described it a bit earlier. I want to flip that now to Hudson. One of the things that I've read about Irembo is that it's a very interesting and successful example of a private-public partnership. Is that what's being thought of now as well as the digital ID system is being planned? Is that another way that the government is looking at implementing this?
Yeah, so the government owns about 85% of the shares in Irembo, and the private sector owns about 15%. And currently, they have not really communicated about how the new digital ID will be owned or will be run. But I think, considering the success that Irembo has enjoyed because of the private and public partnership, I think this is something that the government would want, to consider. And of course, I think we will know more details as things keep developing. This digital ID things are some of those that I'm really keeping my eyes on as, the years pass, as we go to the 3 years in which it was promised to be rolled out.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask you, Hilda, Caitlin, Hudson, for a very quick final word for policymakers in Rwanda, but also beyond Rwanda. I mean, we're talking about the entire African continent and the global south as well. Do you have ideas that must be acknowledged before they begin to embark on this kind of exercise? And I'm really happy that we're doing this before Rwanda is actually putting this into practice. So if you have any final thoughts, please share them.
I will say one of the things that is really important for governments or policymakers is to invest sort of like in the ecosystem of services to really realize the full benefits of digital ID. It can do a lot, but if you do not develop sort of like the right use cases for that digital ID, if you don't involve the right partners in delivery of these use cases, then you're spending a lot of money for what will essentially still be used as an analog. So you really prioritize sort of like the design of digital ID enabled use cases and think of what of the use cases that have the biggest impact on public service delivery, what has the biggest impact on economic growth, and what ensures that there is enough social inclusion. So if you invest in the ecosystem of services, people will naturally use it because it's a very natural way of showing this is the benefit of using a digital ID. And because I know what that benefit is, I will use it. So just to summarize, invest in the ecosystem of services, prioritize the design of digital ID-enabled use cases, and you can never understate the importance of creating awareness for digital ID. People will use what they know benefits them.
Thank you, Hilda. Caitlin?
Yeah, to pick up what Hilda is saying, I would say that the government and any government planning a digital ID system really needs to be guided by the specific purpose of each use case and not a general and kind of abstract purpose of a digital ID system. And when looking at different use cases, it's really important to understand whether the digital ID is necessary for all use cases, because there are many where the same digital ID may not be necessary, and whether or not it's proportionate. So there may also be use cases where the high level of security, the high level of trust that's integrated into the smart ID is simply not necessary, and it will lead to greater exclusion to impose that in a disproportionate way on specific use cases. And I will shamelessly take one more moment just to say, I think safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable groups in the country. We've talked about people living in poverty, we've talked about older persons, people living in rural areas, those who are on the wrong side of the digital divide. And one group that we haven't really touched on, but I think is always an important one, is non-citizens. So migrants, refugees, asylum seekers have often been the victims of digital exclusion related to digital ID systems. And the rights and the protection of those groups needs to be a priority from the very beginning.
Thank you, Caitlin. Hudson?
Yeah, sure. I'll wrap up by speaking about the digital ID of Rwanda. I think it will give an opportunity to countries, especially those in Africa, to know, the benefits, the challenges, the risks going forward in this kind of digital move.
Thank you so much, Hilda, Caitlin, Hudson. It's been fantastic talking to you, and I'm so glad that you joined me for the conversation today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Olumide, and to Caitlin and Hudson. It was a pleasure sharing this podcast with you and for your illuminating insights.
So here are some major takeaways for me from this conversation. First, I've learned from Hilda that digital ID systems, apart from being fancy technology upgrades, can actually really be beneficial to people, especially those with limited resources. A digital ID and a properly designed system can translate to hours and money saved from traveling to government offices and queuing for government services. But I've also learned from Caitlin that vulnerable people like the elderly, the poor, or even refugees and migrants can be cut out of these systems, either deliberately or by system error. So it's extremely important that human rights impact assessments be conducted before Rwanda rolls out its smart ID cards. And finally, I've learned from Hudson that Rwanda already has a good working digital governance platform called Irembo, which has been hugely successful, partly because the government partnered with private organizations. If authorities do the same with the new smart IDs, it will help boost gains for the system. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Rwanda's anticipated digital ID cards and about the potential issues with digital ID card systems globally, we have found and compiled a list of the most interesting papers and articles on our website. That is afripoly.org/podcasts. The Africa Hour is brought to you by APRI, Africa Policy Research Institute, and is produced by BR Radio. I am Olumide Abimbola. Our producer is Shola Lawal, with assistance from Hannah Lang in Berlin and Alison Garambe in Kigali.